Before we get started, I'd like to urge anyone to log into Slido and ask any questions you may have. So don't be shy. I'm going to start with kind of an observation that leads into a question, and I'll probably mostly aim this one at John. If we look back at U.S. housing starts back in the 70s and early 80s, you would get these massive swings of up to 600,000 delta on housing starts. And John indicated that there's just no way we could do that now, and I tend to agree with that assessment. But what's changed? Why can't we do that?
Well, we had a baby boom, then we had a baby bust. We had to build for a baby boom. If you drill down under the hood on some of those, there was a tax act basically that incented people to build apartments even though they were going to lose money doing so. They'd save enough money on taxes, and then a couple years later they wiped out the tax act. So you just have to study the numbers. But I would say that the biggest of which was really the baby boom. And if you want to get even a little more morbid about it, I mean, we lost a lot of people during all those world wars. We haven't been losing the people. And so the demand was lower, and then it spiked in the 70s and 80s, and that was a one-time event.
I guess from the supply side, I guess is one of the things that keeps coming up is that land entitlement is much more difficult. What's going on there?
I think Doug Yearley from Toll said it best, is that the one thing the industry, and he was speaking to Wall Street, does not understand is just how hard it is to get land approved. It is not just going down to the city and saying, hey, I'd like to build some nice homes. I mean, they put you through the ringer. Yeah. And now so I was thinking about your comment on cycle time, Margaret. I'd love to know how much of the length and cycle time has been driven by city approval processes. You build one home in one city and you bring it to the next city, and the fire marshal there wants things different than the fire marshal the other way. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's not just getting it approved, which is the entitlement process, but then you have to get it improved, which is the development process.
And the inspections.
The impact fees and the inspections and all of the additional costs that are not factored in, all of that gets passed along to the consumer. And it is incredibly inefficient because it's different by market.
And it's different in every single city.
Yeah.
So that leads us to which regions are the most demanding ones for off-site buildings and why? And what type of homes are being demanded? Multi, single, affordables?
You've done more on offsite, so.
D, all of the above. Well, I think where people are living and where they're concentrated, definitely California, because it's such a big state, 20% of housing starts are out there. The concentration of the population itself is greater, so that allows for it, but also the capital is available.
Well, I also think California, it's really expensive to build, particularly on the coasts, and so that's where it's easier to disrupt. When it takes something like that apartment project I showed you, probably was $250 to $300 a square foot and probably took a couple years to build on site. It's easier to show benefit in that type of environment than there is in Dallas or Houston, where they just get out of your way and let you build.
And so, how do we overcome the typical approach used by developers of design and build, which doesn't allow to make the most of the efficiencies for offsite? I mean, how do we?
Well, and that's what I was talking about with ICG and with Entegra and these folks. So they build each house twice. The first time is in 3D, and you can actually walk through the house as a consumer or as an architect, an engineer, everyone in that process. So you're rationalizing the waste then, but we absolutely have to start with design. And you have to go back to the drawing board. I think part of it is just laziness. As an industry, we tend to reuse the same floor plans a lot. It's easier to do that than to start again and think about it differently. Or we can get the lumber company to work with us to provide floor trusses or roof trusses, wall panels, but we can't get the framer to install those because in our industry, we motivate the framers to waste lumber because we pay them by the foot. So everyone has to be involved. To be, as I said, one of the keys to being successful is really thinking it through, all the way through, and then just being committed to it.
Okay. And, switching to modular, this is addressed to John, but I think Margaret would have some interesting comments too. As how will the traditional banks and mortgage organizations participate in the modular sector? Will it either slow down growth or will there be an innovation that facilitates change in financing?
Yeah, the lack of availability of financing, because just to explain to the audience, typically the mortgage that's available for a mobile home is actually on the house itself, not on the house plus the land, because it's considered a temporary dwelling. So the average mortgage rate is more than twice that of what a traditional single family would be. I know that the Clayton Homes Group is doing a terrific job of increasing awareness and trying to negotiate with the lenders themselves, through Berkshire Hathaway, a big lender as well, to try to address that.
I think ultimately it's Fannie and Freddie and FHA that set the rules, because 70% of the mortgages end up getting purchased or insured by them. And I know Fannie is looking into allowing that to happen. So that's what would cause it to change.
Okay. So Pulte invested millions in off-site manufacturing, and then they abandoned it during the downturn. Do you see them getting back in the game? They could have dominated if they held on. Not my comment.
Yeah. So, and one of my employees actually was heavily involved with Bill Pulte on that. Offsite requires a big capital expenditure, and most of the builders have never really been that big. Lennar and Horton are now. Pulte was decent sized at the time. But they built that plant in Phoenix at the right before a major housing downturn in a market that was very close to Mexico. And so I think theoretically it made a lot of sense, but the cost savings to build on site were pretty low. And then as a publicly traded home builder, you're basically scored on quarterly earnings, and I think penalized for having a lot of CapEx. So I think the CapEx has got to be done off balance sheet. NVR has those plants, but NVR built those plants in the 1980s, then filed bankruptcy, wrote them off, and then has been building on them ever since. And to my knowledge, NVR hasn't built a new plant in the last 30 years. So here's somebody who does offsite, who's not really expanding and doing it already.
They're not increasing their range. But Toll Brothers has factories that they've continued to invest in over the cycles. And I think what's unique about Pulte is their CEO is my age. He's in his 40s. Most of the home building CEOs are about 20 years older. And so if there is a company that has that DNA in their culture, because Bill Pulte in our industry was, unfortunately passed away, but he was such a wonderful tinkerer. He was always thinking about new product and new ways to build it. If there was a company that was going to do it, it might be Pulte.
Yeah.
All right. Do either of you care to comment on how modular construction will impact the sale and distribution of building products and materials?
What are we talking about with modular? Is that prefab or is that full 3D? That's one thing I always just try to define. But I think it's going to be significantly disruptive to distribution of building materials, which is significantly inefficient. So that'll be good.
I'll give you one anecdote. So two of my team members just toured, Katerra guy's here, so he can talk about this, but they toured the Katerra plant in Phoenix, and one of the things they learned is that they were installing the windows like you always install them, just putting them straight in, and then they didn't ship very well, and they were having breakage problems, and so they wanted to shift the process to get a different type of window where you slide up through the frame and just make it better. You know, if you're the window guy who doesn't have that new process, you're going to lose some market share. So I do think there are a lot of things here that the building products guys need to learn so they can adopt.
Most window companies have small print in the contracts with the manufacturers that if the product is shipped flat, that they lose the warranty. So they have to be shipped upright.
So, John, if we're looking at a 2 to 5 year time frame, how will immigration play into your housing starts story?
So we've considered that. So the Census Bureau publishes immigration numbers that actually are pretty decent, and they do include their best estimate of people illegally coming on or off the borders, and our numbers are a little bit lower because we're betting the under on the Census Bureau on immigration. But really, that's just the margin. I mean, that would impact the volume by tens of thousands of units, not hundreds of thousands. When people come to the United States, they, particularly from south of the border, they generally live with friends and family. They don't create a lot of housing demand for a while, and eventually they do.
Okay. We'll have a couple more questions. We're already cutting into the break, but this is such great information we're getting. How will Amazon, through the Alexa Fund and Alexa Fund funding, investing in plant prefab, how Amazon, through Alexa Fund, investing in plant prefab, how could that change the custom single and multifamily home market?
Is plant prefab, is Steve here? So we helped Steve Glenn, who's the founder of Plant Prefab, last year when he was raising capital. We helped introduce him to his first lead investor, and then Amazon came into it, and it was interesting. I think they wrote a $2 million check or something. It was tiny, but all of a sudden it was a much easier deal to sell because Amazon was there. But I think the opportunity is for this fast decision process, this frictionless sales process to the consumer, and that's what the consumer wants, and it's a very simple product. John and I, we talk a lot about what's going on in the industry, and you had that great idea that if you had the Tesla of modular, good, better, best, and an architect like Steve Glenn, who's really known, he's a star architect. He's got a fantastic reputation in California for building small $1 million homes, but also celebrity $10 million homes. And to be able to put that together and provide something that's very effective would be attractive. And of course, Amazon has a lot of cash, but then so does Clayton Homes, and they're doing this too. Through Berkshire Hathaway.
I'm actually surprised Amazon hasn't come in a big way yet, because if you look at what their goal seems like to me, it basically, if they could build, imagine it was just a great house, like a Tesla house. Everything worked, everything talked to each other, and then they completely set you up so everything you wanted to purchase for the rest of your life was very easy, and reordering the air filters and everything else. Frankly, why would they need to make money on the house? I mean, they could sell the house at break even if I'm going to make money on the resident for the rest of their life. So if I were them, that's how I'd be looking at that. So, and Adrian Foley of Brookfield is one of the most thoughtful people in the industry, and he has partnered with them on a lot of the smart home initiatives. And he said that's one of his biggest things that keeps him up at night is when one of the big boys are going to move in with a completely different business model and disrupt the industry.
Brookfield Residential, the home builder, is owned by Brookfield Asset Management, which also has a fund, Brookfield Ventures, out of Silicon Valley just to invest in construction technology. But it's not just Amazon. You have Google and lots of these big players saying we are going to help to address the lack of attainability in California. They're making huge commitments. It's not yet clear if they're going to partner with people in this room and invest or how they're going to make it happen, but they're dedicated to it.
Okay. We've talked a lot about builders and building products. What about the supporting pieces like HVAC and plumbing? Are they moving forward at an acceptable rate to change with the times? Would you say?
I mean, I don't really have an opinion on that.
I think that they are, because some of the zoning requirements and the licensing around plumbing and HVAC is more strict, and in particular around energy usage, air circulation, the risks when air is not clean. A lot of home builders focus on healthy homes. So I think that they are picking up. Some of them are Japanese owned or European owned, so that helps as well.
One thing I can add to that is I've learned is, I mean, the home builders do almost no consumer research, believe it or not, almost none.
I believe it.
No, I know, because we try to sell it to them, and it's not easy. But the building products guys do a ton, and they never share it with the home builders. And so it's really surprising to me that the relationship between the building materials and the home builder is my sales guy and your purchasing agent. There's nobody involved talking about what's going on in new home sales or sharing thoughts on what's going on in the consumer. We have a conference we started, again, only 3 years ago, called the Design Summit, and we put a lot of these creative people in the room together, and the guy from Whirlpool probably had the best comment, and he just realized, I spend millions of dollars a year deciding what people want in their kitchen, and I just learned that the people that are designing the kitchens view us as nothing more than a hole in the wall that needs to be filled. And when he presented on his consumer research, you should have seen the notepads coming out. I mean, the builders had no idea. So I think for those of you who do a lot of consumer research, there's a real opportunity to get your consumer research experts to talk to a different person at the builder who may be deciding on innovation, not negotiating purchases, to really have you collaborate, which I thought you said was a great idea, to partner with your customers. I think the wrong people are talking to each other.
Great. Great. I want to thank Margaret for bringing up her pale male stale criticism. It's, we tried to invite Justin Trudeau, but he couldn't make it. So, but it is very thoughtful criticism, and we're going to take that into account next year. And at this point, we'll just switch to a break, and we'll be around. Everyone will be around for questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So, Robert and George, could I ask you to come up under the and sit in the chairs while we cook up some good questions for you? So the first question, I guess, this would be for Robert. Sure. Do you have the capacity? Oh, now things are changing. Rocky, where is my? Oh, the questions are bumping around. I thought they were going to be locked. Yeah, I've lost that question. Okay. Do you have the capacity to have the vacant derelict land by 2025?
Do we have the capacity to do so?
Yeah.
The challenge with it is actually classifying it all and understanding even like the geological conditions, etc., and correspondingly what can actually be done on it. But there's a large exercise that's now been undertaken by a consultancy practice named Ryden Construction to categorise that vacant derelict land in order to bring it back into productive use. So there is there's a large driver behind it, and it's it's endorsed by Scottish Government. So in that respect, we would hope to see it be in half by that date. Yeah.
And this question, perhaps either of you can answer, or both. You say innovation should drive regulation. Can you give some examples of when this has been successfully accomplished?
I think, so the premise for that is a lot of our work for off-site fabricators, house builders, etc., has been driven by primarily regulations around fabric performance. And actually, what's happening in the current context is that the brick and block lobby in the UK have undermined, in many respects, that sort of regulatory threshold, because it's more difficult for those guys to ascertain it. And there's also been anomalies whereby the use and application of renewables, rather than going for a fabric-first approach, has again undermined the fabric performance. So that's been challenged. So the innovation work that's been undertaken by these organisations, which has put the bar high, has then been undermined in many respects. But because of that innovation, it's trying to readdress that balance such that you go for a fabric-first approach.
Right.
So you would, there's obviously renewables is what we want to utilise for our energy source, but if you've got a leaky building, then why are you putting renewables on the roof? Right. What you should do is have a fabric-first approach, veering towards things like passive house type standards, and using renewable options to drive a low energy requirement rather than the other way around. So there's a necessity to demonstrate through evidence-based research and innovation that is a better approach. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And this next question is actually, this is something that George and I were actually discussing last night at dinner, and it has to do with the Grenfell fire. And the question that was asked is, have you faced increased resistance to wood because of the devastating London fire? I'm not sure if the questioner knows that, in fact, there have been code changes as a result of that fire. Could you describe what those code changes are, and what long-term impact you think that may have on the consumption of CLT in the UK?
Yeah, just sort of maybe take up the last question. The innovation, it drives regulation, but there's a lag of at least 5 to 10 years, and I think part of this has to do obviously with vested interest. In the case of the Grenfell fire, I would say yes. I mean, the fire safety has been entirely redefined, and there's now a sort of distrust of wood when, the fire was just really down to polymers and had absolutely nothing to do with it. In terms of the changes we've seen, I'm not obviously conversant with the actual legal aspect, but I've seen that looking to, for instance, renew your professional insurance would result now in having to fill 500 pages of disclaimers that you have never, ever worked with cladding whether that was 25 years ago or last week. So it has changed enormously. It has an impact on the premiums, an impact on the way you actually approach the profession of architecture in the UK.
Yeah, sure. I think it's 80 metres high is now the limitation in the UK currently for CLT being used for medium/high-rise type construction. So it's completely undermined that market from a, in many respects, a knee-jerk reaction and a lack of understanding of what the material performance or what the performance of CLT is within fire. So coming back, that's again how the sort of innovation piece can again challenge that regulatory requirement through the evidence base of what's happening in other countries such as the Norway example and how they've went about demonstrating access and egress relative to the fire performance requirements. We all know that timber chars, and correspondingly is even used in some senses to protect steel in instances for fire performance. So there's just an inherent understanding that needs to take place and an upskilling with regards to people's understanding of how mass timber and CLT can be used. And even within that, across the different products, there's how CLT will perform relative to nail lamination, relative to dowel lamination. They all perform differently, but we need to have that understanding in order to challenge the regs.
And for those of you who may not know, the Grenfell fire in London had absolutely nothing to do with CLT. I think George just mentioned that. There was no CLT in the building.
Just plastics.
Yeah. It was plastic.
Flammable plastic.
But the code changes were essentially applied to any combustible material on the exterior of a building, and CLT was considered to be, in their terms, combustible, so it was negatively impacted. Have you had any pushback from trade unions in Scotland?
No, I wouldn't.
With respect to offsite construction?
No, there's not. I wouldn't say there's any pushback in terms of trade. We've got, in the UK-wide, it's 25% in terms of market share for housing in terms of the use of industrialised timber construction. Scotland is 85%, largely because the necessity to get wind and water tight quicker, or weather conditions necessitate that. We've also always had a higher bar in terms of our regulatory performance requirements in terms of fabric performance, and correspondingly, it's moved on in that respect and taken the sort of joiner trades, etc., with it. Right. So we have that in a sort of a traditional makeup. So there's not been any pushback in a Scottish context.
But OSM does raise issues of labour. This actually has been brought up in a number of similar conferences. It doesn't affect timber or OSM as such, but for instance, in England, the average age of a bricklayer now is around 54, which means that there is an essential part of the trade which not only is on its way out, but also is now can no longer cover the needs of the industry. And OSM might come into this. So you might argue that by the time the robots come into the factory to take over the jobs, they won't find anyone because they will all have retired.
Okay.
Yeah, skills crisis. Yeah.
Have you made models with mechanical, electrical, plumbing built into them? Question.
I haven't personally, no.
Some of the work that we did last year did start engaging sort of all those dimensions. Say, for instance, there's a lot of research on using magnets as substitutes for bonding chemically. And there are a couple of really facile students there that could and have probably worked with electronics in different contexts in other classes. So it would be fairly easy, especially now with the democratization of hardware components, to bring the two together, absolutely.
Right. Okay. I did this. One of my questions is just, where do you see off-site construction going in the UK, and how quickly is it going to happen?
Yeah, the million-dollar question, isn't it? But where it is right now, there's a real emphasis behind it. But, I'll go back to all those different drivers, and where they're intersecting right now all point towards a more industrialised approach. In that regard, the different facets of it. So whether it be full volumetric, with all the services, etc., or whether it's sub-assemblies pre-manufactured off-site, so there's no waste on site, so it's a kit of parts which are assembled on site. I think ultimately has to go in that direction because it's the only way of we're going to be able to deliver
Right.
what's necessary.
My understanding is that the UK is falling short by about 100,000 housing units a
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, so the requirement's
Pretty much.
250 to 300,000, and it's about
And
2,000,
with
yeah.
Brexit, it could exacerbate the labor situation
Yeah.
in the UK.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
I was following with great interest the Blue Look presentation where I think it was 12,000 units, was it?
Yes.
Which is, the current government targets are around 250,000 units a year, which, we're obviously below that. And there is obviously a lot of room for OSM. I was delighted to see that IKEA is actually working in 3 countries and the UK is one of them, because we do seem to find ourselves always in the eye of the storm. So I'd say overall the predictions are good, but we are way, way short of the actual targets that the government has set. So OSM has a role to play, but I think the problems are a bit more structural.
Okay.
And I think just to pick up, one of the aspects that certainly we're looking at more and more now is the procurement and planning issues around it, and the procurement model and the traditional construction business model and the cash flow cycle. So, we're currently in conversation with Edinburgh City Council about a strategic project which links in with Offsite Solutions Scotland,
Right.
to look at how you can actually revisit the procurement process such that you can engage with the OSM partners a lot earlier, because the current model doesn't facilitate that.
Sure. Okay.
So we need to change the mindset and the approach. But what we are finding certainly is, from government to the councils, they're up for that because of the necessity to deliver affordable housing.
Okay. Okay, well, at that point, I'd like to thank George Legendre and Robert Hairstans
Thank you.
very much for coming to present to us, and also the students from Harvard. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.